I didn't realize it happened when they put out that package last year.
The blue and red?
The two albums, and I just thought, presumed that they would just copy them from the masters and put them out. And I didn't even listen to it until after it was out, and I took it back and I played it. It was embarrassing, I mean, some of the tracks survived, but it was really embarrassing. Some fool had tried to make it stereo and it didn't work.
Yeah. People should stay with the mono and not be so concerned.
because, there's a difference between stereo and mono, obviously, and if you mix something in mono and then try and fake it, it just, you lose the guts of it, and a lot of them lost the fast version of Revolution was destroyed, I mean, it was a heavy record, and then they made it into a piece of ice cream. But never mind, it's all the past, isn't it?
Hello, and welcome to episode 283 of Something About the Beatles podcast, with returning guests, pals of mine, Jerry Hammack, engineer, producer, Beatle historian, and author. You probably know him best for the Beatles Recording Manual Reference Series, volumes 1 through 5. There's a new book he's got out that just came out. In fact, we'll talk about it a little bit. Not really about the Beatles per se. Well, I guess I'll let him speak for himself, but it's not a Beatles history. Rather, it is a user's manual for anybody out there that does their own recording of their own music or somebody else's music. In any event, you do recording. It is the Beatles recording techniques, recording the classic EMI recording studio sound in your home studio. So the elevator pitch, the nutshell summary of this book is how to implement the kind of digital technology people have accessible to them now to emulate and get close to the sounds produced in the 60s at EMI with George Martin and the engineers working on Beatle recordings. But there's a lot more in it than that in terms of what your approach should be, recording philosophies and preparations, setup, all that sort of thing from a guy who's been doing it for years and years and knows a thing or two about the Beatles. So check that out. And my other returning guest and pal, producer John Leckie, who I love having on the show. We've had him on, first show we had him on was discussing his work starting as a tape op in 1970 at EMI, the Abbey Road facility, working on All Things Must Pass and Plastic Ono Band albums. So we had 2 different shows on that. We've had him back a few times since, and always great to get his insights and takes on anything, really. But today's show is kind of a long overdue examination in general on the reissue, remaster series of product they've been putting out since the 2017 50th of Pepper. And of course, we have since had the 50th of Abbey Road, 50th of White Album, a Revolver set, and most recently, the Red and Blue reissues that came out November last year alongside the Now and Then single. These have been supervised by Sam Okell and Giles Martin. We haven't really talked on this show, given any sort of critique of that work, but today we do, and sort of examine how successful it's been done, especially with the sort of radical reimaginings that have been done on the Red and Blue sets of certain songs. And the red one because you had the much more primitive technology to work with when applying the MAL technology, the MAL technology to that, and basically breaking these mono recordings into multi-tracks which you could then tweak and mix, versus the later recordings which are already state-of-the-art. I'm speaking of Abbey Road and that era. Also, there was a Let It Be box as well. And less of a need for really bringing them up to scratch because they already were. But in some cases, they did their thing anyway. I'm looking at you, I'm the Walrus. And make of it what you will. But we'll be discussing that in this show. So between them, we've got 4 great ears that have put in the time professionally through the years, as well as big Beatle guys, to take a look at this stuff. Beyond that, we are now on Evergreen. I do encourage you to check out other shows that are on the network. Some that I think align with this audience in terms of being about history, being about music, being about film, just the arts generally. There's a lot there for you. There's one show in particular, it's a podcast on the Billy Joel song, We Didn't Start the Fire, where they basically break it down line by line and go through it to annotate it, basically. Just explain the historic context between what he was spitting out in that song. There's certain lines that people would have picked up the first time that are inescapable. You know exactly what he's talking about. JFK blown away. What else do I have to say? Is one that comes to mind. But they built a whole podcast series out of going through that entire baby boomer history. So it's definitely worth checking out, if you will. So there you go. We start out this conversation with John and Jerry. I gave Jerry the floor to explain himself with what might not be his only published work this year. This might be a good point to bring up your book, Jerry.
Is there ever a good point to bring? Is there ever not a good point to bring up my book?
Right.
Oh,
there it is.
John's got it. Look at that.
One thing I got to say, Jerry, actually, on page 38 here, you have a picture of an SM57.
Oh, yeah. And I do that those are alternative options that people have.
Options to D19s.
Yeah.
If you don't want to spend $800 on a D19, then you buy a 57.
So I do call out the actual mics that were in use, and then for all of the sections that I talk about, what they used in the era, I also will bring up modern contemporary options that you have. So there with a real straightforward dynamic microphone, a 57's an obvious
because I never saw a Shure microphone, I saw a 57 or a 58 until I left Abbey Road.
Yeah,
and I go to it and I said, what's this? It's an American mic. It's American. Plug it in. But no, it was all AKGs at Abbey Road. It's all AKG and Neumann and STC. That was it, really.
Yeah.
But I never saw a 58 or a 57.
Well, mercifully, in my list of actual gear that was being used, I don't mention them.
No, you don't. No, you don't. I did check because as soon as I saw that photo, I thought, he's got it wrong. But no, when I read it, you got it right.
Oh, thank God.
And the only other thing I picked up on was the curve bender. I can't remember what it is, the curve bender parametric thing, which is passive if you don't plug it in. But as soon as you plug it in, there's a 30 dB loss. And so you have to bring that 30 dB line level up because you've plugged in this huge resistor, which is the curve bender.
Interesting.
And the reason they were never used is because as soon as you pump it up 30 dB, it's all noise and hiss.
Interesting.
And that's why I never use it. Now, in the TG mastering console, that's great. That's there. And I don't think I ever saw them being used even in mastering, those curve benders. They're always upstairs in the cupboard getting dust, and it's like, what's this for? And I drag it out and someone say, you've got to put a 30 dB amp on that. Because as soon as you plug it in, it cuts down.
Yes, I talked to Ken Townsend about the use of it, and it was used primarily in tracking when it was used. It was during the Pepper era, and it was still primarily associated and tied to the mastering work.
Yeah.
But it was accessible through the patch-based system.
Yeah, there was a floating one. Yeah.
And so they would patch it in, but it was not in the studio. It was in
upstairs.
Yeah, and so they would call Ken or whatever recording engineer was on at the time, and they would tell them the adjustment that they needed made to it. They'd say, put it in line, and then we want the treble at 1 plus 2 at
yeah.
So can you imagine? I can't imagine. Yeah, so that book that John so graciously held up there, that's the new one, Beatles Recording Techniques. And for people that do recording or producing or mixing, this will give you a pretty solid idea of how to use your contemporary system, your DAW, to recreate the tones that were being created at EMI in the 60s and the early 70s. But maybe more importantly, help you understand the mindset and the workflow that was behind production and mixing and overall recording at EMI. Because if you don't have the two together, you're never going to get the sound.
Mm-hmm.
So to sum up, this is for anybody recording now that wants to get the sound the Beatles were achieving at EMI in the 60s with modern gear.
That's it. That's the bottom line. And I go through all of the components of the studio environment. I go through the signal chains that were used during the Red era and the TG era. and give you a simplified, I don't expect anyone, and no one should, try to recreate the entire signal flow of the consoles that were going on. But there's a fundamental signal flow that if you put in place and you use in the manner that it was used, implement it in the way that it was used, you'll get that fundamental vibe. It's not a recipe book. You're not going to be able to turn to page 100 and get George's solo guitar sound from And I Love Her or something. It's not the way anything works in the studio, but this will set you up to get that feel, the overall tonality of the work that was done. And again, I think most importantly, get your head in the right place to make music in the way that the Beatles made it. The Beatles, through Martin, made choices and stuck to them. And everything built upon the last choice that was made. He didn't leave it open and be like, well, in a couple of months, I'll see what these songs really sound like. They always made the song sound as good as it could right
before
at the
you
moment.
Went home.
Or
before you went home.
Before you went home. That was it. Or you go home because we're not recording that crap.
You go home and worry about it.
There you go.
Would this be accurate to say that it's a way of achieving through digital technology analog sound?
Yeah, that's a small part of it, I think, of the book.
Okay.
It's not just the technology, it's really the inspiration to perform, really, that comes across. I mean, nearly every chapter, Jerry either introduces it or finishes a chapter by saying, of course, if you don't perform the song, if you don't have a great song, you shouldn't go in the studio until you're rehearsed. You know what your instrumentation is, whether you're going to have a clavinet or a flute, what the drummer's going to play. Then go in the studio and make the record. And believe me, you have a much better time because there's confidence and the results are just a little bit better. And it's an exciting thing rather than going in the studio and looking at each other saying, what are we going to do then? Well, just get the click track out and start with a drum loop or something. That's not it. That's what excited me about what you were saying in the book, Jerry, really, was giving advice to bands and young, people making music and are not experimenting. There's always a space for the experimentation, but getting the job done is recording the song with the best performance and the best instrumentation.
Yeah, and the inspiration that creates these unique tones can only come after you've mastered the basics, after you've got the fundamentals down. And if you think about that in the recording environment, the fundamentals are, I've got a solid backing track to go. I know this track so well that we can nail this and be ready to move. That gives you the freedom, the space, the time, if experimenting is your thing, to go down that road. But I've always found that when I'm working with a band, that these things tend to organically suggest themselves. As the tones start to develop, the song starts to develop, and again, you're building off of the last great thing you did. There's a momentum that comes from that and a freedom that comes that allows you to try things, to try and to fail, but in a positive way, not I'm trying and failing because I don't know what I'm doing.
Right.
Which will only make things worse.
To break the rules, you first have to understand the rules.
Yeah, it truly is fundamental to all art. Picasso was an innovative artist because he knew what the rules were, so he knew what he could break. He knew what he could tear apart. Ken Townsend at EMI, in support of all the acts that were there, he could offer the solutions that he offered when bands like the Beatles in particular got demanding of him. When Lennon said, I'm really tired of singing all those vocals twice. Ken knew the gear and the technology well enough to be able to think outside of it and say, you know what? If I do this between two machines and add this oscillator in here, I can simulate a live performance. And artificial double tracking is born, right? But it's only by knowing those fundamentals and mastering those fundamentals, whatever the art or technology is, that you can push it, that you can recombine it and make something entirely new. And that's what, the Beatles toolkit was so simple, so simple. And I'm terrible at math, but, do the math. If I've got 7 variables, right? how many possible combinations of those variables do you have at the end of the day? It's probably a pretty big number.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all they were doing. They were just taking the variables and recombining them in different ways to get unique sounds.
Mm-hmm.
There's something to be said for having limitations.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have limitations, you don't end up finishing anything. And if you don't finish anything, then you don't have any art out the back end. And the work at EMI in the era, the whole idea of it was to produce content. It was to produce finished recordings that they could take out to the marketplace and sell. The end. So you didn't go in there of like, oh, God, I get to play with, I get to play at Abbey Road Studios. No. We're here to work. We're here to do a job. We're here to get a record done. The initial sessions, they would book 3-hour blocks. And in a 3-hour block, you were expected to come in and finish a record.
Mm-hmm.
A-side and B-side.
A-side and B-side.
4 songs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and more is better.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the nature of this. There's nothing to be gained by indecision.
Lack of preparation.
Yeah, and lack of preparation. So be prepared and make choices, commit to those choices, commit to your vision, and you'll grow through that. It isn't that work is going to be perfect. The Beatles didn't like half of the stuff they recorded. We all hear stories of Lennon saying he didn't like the mix of Strawberry Fields.
Right.
He didn't like Strawberry Fields.
Particularly that one. And when Lennon said about he wanted to redo all the songs again, and George Martin said, even Strawberry Fields. And he said, particularly that one.
So there you go. There's an example of, we see that work as perfection. We see that work as just some of the most brilliant stuff that was ever done. But the creators of that, they don't have the same view of it. They were seeking something more, but they still finished it.
Right.
They still finished it.
And so what this book is not is a telling of the Beatles recording history per se, like
not
walking.
at all.
Yeah. I've seen some online chatter about, didn't we get this with Lewison's book and things like that. And that's not what this is. You're missing the point. Read the title again.
Yeah. Well, not even the recording reference manuals that I did that have been out for a few years. Those aren't Lewison's book either. Those are a whole different thing. But getting mentioned in the same sentence, I'm not like upset by that. But that's not the book you're buying. So yeah, please read the description. I am very plain and very upfront about what the books are. So
he fooled me.
Yeah. He took my money. That wasn't the book I expected to buy. Yeah.
John, were you much familiar with these sets back before the recent reissue of them?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I never kind of bought them, but I remember younger people, I could say, had the red and blue one because they discovered the Beatles from those albums. So I was really aware of them, yeah. Although I knew all the songs, before they came out.
Yeah, sure. The reason I ask is because initially when they did come out in the 70s, and John specifically talked about this in a radio interview, that he was mortified when they compiled them that they hadn't used the proper masters in some instances, or they used fake stereo, and he just was embarrassed by it. He specifically cited Revolution. It was mastered in mono for the single because it was a B-side. It was not an album track. And then when they tried to make it stereo, the separation was so broad that it just sounded so thin, and he thought it was awful. And that was the way millions of people were hearing it. And you could cite other examples as well. Jerry, I'm sure you're quite familiar with the shortcomings, but it was one of these things that, yeah, it served a purpose as a sample to the music, but it was not optimum sound. And so that has been a chronic complaint for 50 years about these sets.
I didn't know that. Stereo mono, yeah, different. You know, suddenly, I guess when they came out, people, when did they come out? 1973, 4?
Yep, 73.
73, yeah. Everyone was into hi-fi. Everyone was into bass and hi-fi home speakers and that kind of thing, and stereo, you know. And probably 4 or 5 years before that, end of the 60s, they didn't have the hi-fi. They had what we call the dansette, which was a mono, self-contained thing with its own speaker. They didn't have bookshelf speakers or fancy made in Japan gear. I mean, for us anyway, it was always Hitachi and all those different Pioneer and things.
So you bring up a good point about the means that people would be listening to sort of dictated the way that the releases would go.
Yeah.
Back when it's AM radio in the States and little 3-inch mono speakers, that's how the singles would be mastered and created for that listening experience.
Yeah. They were trying to do the best at the time. They weren't sort of thinking, oh, everyone's playing this on little speakers or handheld transistor radios, so we're going to make it sound like that. Mm-hmm. You know, that wasn't the thinking at the time.
I should make the distinction in the States, maybe. Capitol Records, I don't know if you're aware of this, how their whole philosophy was not necessarily to treat the Beatles recordings as sacrosanct in the 60s, but they would add the reverb to them. They would tweak them. And that was another thing that drove the Beatles nuts, was like, what is this stuff? You know, like the example a lot of people give is I Feel Fine, She's a Woman, that single where it literally sounds like it was recorded in a cavern. It is just so
I didn't
boomy.
know that.
Oh, yeah. As an American fan, I remember the first time I heard the British iterations of that, I was shocked by the clarity. And suddenly it sounded like the four Beatles in a room rather than playing in this big, huge cavernous thing.
Wow, I didn't know that. Well, you see, what that is getting radio play and someone at the record company kind of saying, it doesn't sound like a radio single. We need to put some reverb on it. And actually, it's quite sensational when you finish the mix. I've done it myself. When you finish the mix and someone says, it's a bit dry, can't it sound bigger? And so you just copy the mix through a little bit of reverb and it fills the whole thing out and kind of thing. I've done that myself with finished mixes. Not to an extreme, but I can imagine someone at the record company, some A&R man or connected with the radio plugger, which is their main avenue of promotion, really, is getting it played on the radio. And they will do anything, whether it's an edit, all sorts of things, just to get it on the radio. And what the public hear may not be an enhancement. It might, as with this, they put the reverb on to make it sound explosive on the radio. Maybe to make it sound like Phil Spector, because there is that. That was big at the time. It doesn't sound like a Phil Spector record. Let's put some reverb on it.
There you go. Radio to this day is, it's heavily limited, right? So you're hearing everything, but no one's going to be producing or mixing for that heavily limited output. You're trying to create the best overall mix that you can create when you're doing it. So the Beatles mixing in mono, certainly mixing for the market, but they would know more mix for a 4-inch speaker on a dance setup than we would these days mix for earbuds. You don't mix for earbuds. You make the best mix of the music you can, given the release format. And at delivery, those kind of preferences will kind of sort themselves out. Certainly in the US, radio and pleasing radio, you got to do it.
So then how do you count for the fact that we've had this conversation on the show before when you talk about classic rock recordings, such as what the Beatles created in the 60s and everybody else did, where there's this whole wide dynamic frequency range of soft and loud at the appropriate times as the music dictates, whereas everything being mastered now is so loud, so brick-walled. What is responsible for that philosophical change?
Technology, because you can.
There's no aesthetic justification?
Yeah, because you always want your record to be louder than everyone else's. And of course you do, because obviously I guess that's a natural thing, to make it louder than everyone else so you stick out. But because of the technology, because of digital, really, because you can do that. There's a Waves L1 limiter, which was, you play your thing through it and you just, how loud do you want it? You could never do that before. It often happened by accident. Maybe it didn't happen by accident. I mean, things like loudness, like Tamla Motown, American pressings, American 7-inch records. In Britain, we could never get them that loud. How on earth those Tamla records used to put them on? And I know because Chris Blair at Abbey Road had Room 24, and all he did was cut mono singles for EMI. He just had one big tannoy speaker in front of him, and he just cut 7-inch mono singles. He wasn't good enough to do stereo or even albums. Harry Moss did albums and someone else would do the stereo. But Chris just had mono singles. So all the Tamla Motown and Liberty and Stateside, everything that came through.
Stax?
Yeah, and Capitol, of course. Everything that came through for British EMI release. Chris would cut the single, and he'd have the copy tape from the States. And then he'd have a copy of the American single. And it's like, how'd you do that? We couldn't do it. You couldn't squeeze it that level onto the grooves. And, you take bass out, you create your room by cutting the low end. But Tamla Motown never did that. It was always like up front and stuff. And that was the difference between the American sound and the UK sound, because all the American engineers wanted to sound like us and we all wanted to sound like you. I always said it was 110 volts. What's the difference? Is that 110 volts must have something to do with American. Whenever I go to an American studio, it's like, fuck, listen to that. How'd you do that? And I'm sure the same thing when Americans like Chad Blake comes over, and it's like, oh, you British guys, how'd you get that sound? And I'm like, no, how'd you do it?
That was greater.
Yeah, maybe it's what you don't have. Probably some of it also had to do with
rock and roll.
There's built-in practices, right? There's this idea that this is the way that we do things. This is how we meet spec.
That's right.
To be sure that when the disc cutter is working on this,
and it's not sent back. It doesn't jump.
Yeah, it doesn't jump. It's not sent back.
If it jumps, they have to repress it all.
Right, and that was the concern when they did Paperback Writer Rain, because they had added that booming element of bass by experimenting with how they were tracking the bass and using that big 15-inch speaker as a mic. And that was a very big concern. They're trying to emulate, like you say, John, the American sound, but they were concerned about actually cutting a successful record without it basically self-sabotaging.
If they'd mastered it in Detroit or Chicago, it would have been 60 dB louder.
And EMI adopted US gear, like the Fairchilds that became well associated with the Beatles. They were initially at Capitol Studios is where they kind of discovered them. They were using these RS-114 limiters that were...
They were shit. No one ever used them when I was there.
Well, they were an attempt to recreate the vibe of the Fairchild. Couldn't do it.
As in the TG compressor limiter.
Yeah, so just go buy a Fairchild.
Yeah, they've still got them. You go to Abbey Road now and there's 6 Fairchilds in the corridor. Just kind of
and no one's standing guard.
Waiting to be used. No one's standing guard. How much are they? The £25,000 each?
Oh, I think actually inflation has hit those even more. The last check I had, they were closer to 40.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Worth every penny, of course. Although the UAD plugin's pretty good.
Yeah, and I'll stick with that myself.
Yeah.
I got 6 Fairchilds too. Don't tell.
One on every track.
No, not quite. That's not the way to do it either. Anyone who thinks so, no, it's not quite the way to do it.
All right, so let's circle back to the Red and Blue albums and try to sort of make sense of what's been happening. Now, Giles and Sam Okell, I think that's how you say his name, have been working in the studio in the post-Love era on trying to bring these recordings up to modern sensibilities. John, have you heard the Love album, the soundtrack to the Vegas show?
Of course, yeah. That was a few years ago. That was great.
Yeah. Okay, so that was your impression when you heard that. Tell me about it. Say more on what you thought when you heard that.
The Love album?
Yeah, the mashups.
Yeah, I thought it was wonderful. I thought it was absolutely wonderful because it exposed all those parts of the Beatles that you loved or parts of the Beatles that you couldn't hear. Some of the a cappella versions were just incredible. And I'd listen to it as a record, as an ambient record, as an Eno record, as a Music for Airports record. That's what I enjoyed about it, is that I could listen to the Beatles as if Eno had done it or something, because a lot of it was kind of floating and ethereal, and you never knew what was. It was like a dream. It was an LSD trip, really, because you never knew what was going to come next. I loved it. I really did.
I could have been happy with a whole series of those. That would have been wonderful. All the songs they didn't touch. Yeah. What about you, Jer?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That reassembly that was done, it was inventive, it was subtle. There was everything right about that. I mean, it's the same thing like Elton John's doing now, right? Elton figured that out too. He's got that Australian duo, I think Fanu, or I think how you pronounce their names, that mash up his tracks. And now he's got, Dua Lipa singing on them and taking these little moments that some of us never knew were there, or back catalog stuff, and bringing it up forward, giving it a new context. That's what happened with Love in a really, really positive way. I think a great use of digging into those original master tapes. Now, what came a little bit later with the 50th anniversary stuff, for me, was not as successful for a whole range of reasons. But the Love Project, I think, it's a great piece.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's safe to say that it raised expectations for sure, because to all the fans, and I would say probably the vast majority, never went to Vegas and saw the Love show. This was what they had. And as John describes, it was just a wonderful background listening experience you would just put on. Some of these songs are familiar to you, but now you're hearing them with fresh ears. All the stuff is being exposed with just remarkable clarity. The isolations, just all these things that if you've thoroughly saturated yourself for decades and decades with the Beatle music, this is something revelatory that you'd always kind of wished would happen, and now it suddenly has. And I hear you guys talk about it and just the tastefulness and the smarts about the way it was done. It was co-credited with George and Giles, right?
Mm-hmm.
It makes you wonder, absent George with everything that came after, what was his role in this? And is that the difference?
Well,
jump in there, Jerry.
I'll walk out on that plank. I feel about the 50th anniversary and about Giles' work on those collections, I feel that he cannot help but bring a personal agenda into it. That there's no way, having your name on it as a producer, having your father having done the original stuff, there's no way that you can't come in here and either be I'm going to make dad proud approach, or I'm going to set myself apart. Even if it's subconscious at some level, it can't be avoided, I don't think, by Giles. Whether this is an upfront thing, a goal going into it that he has personally or not, when you produce something, inevitably there is your handprint on it. I don't know any producer that is 100% invisible. So your taste comes into it, your sensibilities come into it. And now for Giles, generationally, he's got a different view of the music than his father would have. So those overlays, to me, have sent a lot of the 50th anniversary remixes a little south, where they don't register. I asked myself, and Robert and I in side conversations have talked about, was he the right guy for the job? Was he the right name for the job or the right guy for the job? I know he was the right name.
He fit the suit.
Yeah, fit the suit. And why I ask that is I look at other retrospective collections, and primarily I'm thinking here of the work of the Rhino Records guys. And that work almost universally is done with a level of discretion and respect for the initial work, for the initial recordings, that I don't find in the Beatles anniversary tracks.
Say more on that. In terms of comparing Rhino, first, what Rhino are you listening to?
Oh, like the blues collections, for instance.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you had to sum up what is their apparent mission, judging by the work, how would you express that?
I would say that they're janitors. They come in.
They're there for the cleanup?
They clean up the dirt. They clean up the confusion. They bring clarity without changing any of the intent. That's the way that I look at it. You could put a needle drop of an original release and then the work that Rhino did up against it, and all you would hear would be, for simplistic terms, would be a better, clearer version of that track.
Now you're putting your finger exactly on what I expected from the 50th.
The 50th? What do you mean?
Like the deluxe sets that they've been putting out of...
the 50th anniversary.
Yeah, based on what I got out of Love. Hearing that, it's like, wow, this is astonishing. It puts you in the room. You talked earlier before we started about the lo-fi indie production sensibility. And yeah, that became a deliberate thing past a certain point. But then I look at what I was working on my end, recording-wise. I was wanting to jump in and say, look at the productions John Lennon did when he was in a producer's chair, post-Spectre. I think of the Mind Games album specifically, the rock and roll album to a certain degree, how muddy they sound. And how there's been 21st century remixes and remasters of that stuff that suddenly, wow, this is the record he always wanted us to hear, that for whatever reason back in the 70s, that was not apparent. And so it is, that's how I feel with the Beatles stuff, that in no way was George Martin or his team a slouch in giving us the best they could with the technology they had in the 60s. Yet I do see room for improvement. And one of the biggest beefs has been these awful early stereo mixes they did, circa Rubber Soul, where you have the vocals out one side and the backing track out the other. That's an obvious, easy thing to correct and still make it sound sonically wonderful. But it seems like Giles/Sam have taken their brief beyond that to sort of reimagine some of this stuff. And to get back to your point, Jerry, about, well, is he doing this because he can? And maybe Dad would have wanted to do this, but he couldn't at the time, but I can isolate these things and enhance things. Or is he doing it to put his stamp on his father's legacy and the Beatles' legacy?
I think Giles has probably got the most difficult job, really, because in no way can he be compared with his dad. And you've got to think what his dad did had never been heard before. There was no judgment of what had gone before. Everything Giles does, we've heard the music, we've heard the song, we've heard the arrangement. And what we're judging is Giles's manipulation of it, which can be extreme, and like the Rhino thing can be negligible. There's two extremes, really. There's the original mix, and then there's what you could say the rave dub mix. You know, there could be something, if you gave it to some DJs, like what Paul does, where he gives it to Beck and all the, different people do remixes of his songs. The interesting thing, I'm just comparing George and Giles together. I mean, they've got two different agendas, really. All George wanted to do was get a finished record with the Beatles' approval. They were in the room. I don't think there was ever a showdown between George saying, I want this mix, and the Beatles saying, no, I want this mix or something. The vocal should be louder. No, I don't want the vocal louder, which you usually get into when you're making a record. I don't think George got into that. And certainly Giles doesn't have the same responsibility as what George had, because when George did it and finished it, that was it. In everyone's mind, that was it. It was gone forever. Wipe tapes, like they do in television, just wipe the tapes. We've got it. It's been done. That's it. It's finished. Next week's there's another song at number one. So we're dealing with history. When George did it, it was the present to him and everyone. It was the present, wasn't it? And what we're doing is looking back at the past. And Giles has this task of reactivating the past and making it so everyone's happy. Everyone's memory is the same. It's making it sound modern so that teenagers can listen to it. I think if you played Giles's mixes to, a 16-year-old, an 18-year-old or something, let's go a bit older, and a 20-year-old, they would prefer Giles mixes to any of the previous mixes that have been issued because it sounds modern. They can hear it and it sounds like whatever else is going on at the moment. It sounds like a new record. And I think in a way, Giles had that burden on him that maybe, I don't know how much he gets into it, but maybe, he had to make something that sounds like 2024 so that 16-year-old kids can discover it. And it's not mum and dad's or granny and granddad's records, They've got to find it the way we did. And they're not going to find it by a mono mix or a 2019 mix or, some of the other revised stereo things going on. It has to be compatible with every music that's going on. So it's a difficult task, I think, Giles has had. When he presents it, no one's going to judge the music. No one's going to judge the performance. He's not producing it. It wasn't his choice of take, as it were. He's only got one take of the song, one take of everything. All they're going to judge is his manipulation of it. It's like someone looking over your shoulder all the time. And I know it's precious material, and I'm sure he has a few sleepless nights over it, of what he's actually dealing with here.
I think he's in a no-win situation in a lot of ways with what he's doing. And my feedback and my criticism is definitely from someone who experienced the original catalog as the original catalog, not, second or third generation. The issue I have is it's actually something my wife says to me frequently, which is, just because you can, should you? and yeah, she says it's the American in me. The American in me will be like, well, I can do that. And she says, yeah, you can, but should you do it? Giles isn't without choice in this, but his choices come in different areas of what do we bring forward? What do we highlight? What do we bring purely as a mixer? What do I bring attention to? What do I bring ears to?
I think he's done a lot of that.
Yeah, no, he definitely has.
Often unnecessarily.
That's the thing. A prime example for me is, I'm pretty sure that there was never the intention on A Day in the Life that we get to hear Mal count to 24.
Exactly.
Yet
mute it.
Yeah, mute it. They couldn't even mute it in the day, right? With the red consoles, right? You had to pull the fader down.
Yeah.
But yeah, the sorts of things that if you are a completist or like a really deep Beatles fan, you hear that and you're like, oh, that's really cool. Wow, there's Mal counting off all the measures. Isn't that cool? I never heard that before. But that was absolutely not with the intent. The intent was that backing track is going to dissolve as that orchestra explodes. And in Giles's version of A Day in the Life, the orchestra doesn't explode anymore. You hear every bit of it, but it doesn't explode.
There's not many explosions in those mixes at all. Giles just isn't a kind of explosive person. He certainly ain't a punk rocker, is he? He's not John. He's not going to he's not get on the verge of out of control.
That's it. Now, and back to somewhat of our topic with the red and blue. Now, with this, for me personally, I feel like the Red album and not the Blue album, but I feel like the Red album for me is Giles's redemption, because he is almost completely consistently true to the original recordings. His stereo mixes, again, almost completely. I think I noted 22 out of the 30 tracks are clearly superior stereo mixes than anything that's been out there before. They stand emotionally with the music that I love and I remember. They compete with the mono mixes in terms of how they sound, how they feel. I think the Red album is a huge success with that balance of archival purity and contemporary sound. I think it generally got it right.
So it's Rhino worthy.
It's Rhino worthy. There you go.
And maybe with that material, you talk in the early years. First of all, up until Revolver, because there's been a Revolver 50th. So the last tracks on the album, up until then, that was virgin territory. None of that stuff had been tweaked to that point.
Yeah.
And the majority of it is material that had been mono singles to that point. He's got less capability or the option of bringing up a Mal Evans counting in the background because it's not there. These are the most basic tracks of the Beatles' career. Therefore, his path is pretty clear. Yeah, a lot of these were mono singles and he's trying to make them stereo, and you've got the AI Mal technology to separate out things. You could split vocal harmonies now, you could split guitars, things like that were locked into a single track back in the day. He can do that. And to your ears, he's doing it judiciously. He's not creating novelty for novelty's sake. He's respecting the original intent.
Well, for me, the limits that he is facing work in his favor. So the master tapes for these particular tracks are either mono, twin track, or 4-track. And there are very few instances on the tracks that make up the Red album where you've got multiple reels. Where Giles had multiple reels is where he really went south for me, where, you know, he could take that one part before it had gone through a tape reduction and bring it back to life again. Here he's stuck with one tape. Everything's kind of baked in, and he's limited by the Mal technology's ability to discern and extract. And in some cases, it wasn't able to do that. It clearly wasn't able to do that. Like, you get no more bass in songs like All My Lovin' than you did in the original one. Why? Because the backing track was tracked together, bass and drums are tracked together, and those original levels were set such that the bass was a little subservient to the drums, and you can't extract that. It would come up like this PC junky low-end signal. So what do? You leave it together, because that's all you can do with it. You give a clearer version of what's left together. So the limits of what Mal could do and what he had to work with, in this case, limiting his choices, ended up with a better output as far as I'm concerned.
I will tell you that when I listened to it, it was CD. I didn't listen to it on vinyl, which I know is everybody swears is the optimum way these days. And I tend to agree, but that was not an option for me. I listened to it in the car, and I was struck by the freshness, the way some of the tracks sounded. I did definitely pick up on, oh, this is nice. He made some good choices here. But the overall impression I got was there was no consistency to the overall listening experience the way that I felt when I heard the vinyl back in the day. It just seemed like each track was done obviously on an individual basis, but no thought given to somebody listening to this front to back. It was almost jarring, the sonic differences from one track to another. And maybe that had to do also with some of the additions that weren't there before as well. I just couldn't sit back and let the listening experience wash over me because I kept getting jarred. Did either of you guys find that listening to it?
Yeah, I did, in a way. Talking about the early album, all the early
Correct,
stuff,
yeah.
You know, the Please Please Me and I Feel Fine, Day Tripper and things, yeah. It seemed in a way like he was purposely trying to show you things that were hidden. So, for instance, like maybe Hard Day's Night or something, where George's guitar would be really loud at the beginning, and you would never hear the chicka, you know, there was an acoustic there on the original, whether it's mono or stereo. The acoustic was full and fat and was driving, whereas on the new ones, very often the acoustic is just chink, chink, chink. It's almost like a hi-hat in the background, whereas it doesn't have a fatness that it had before. And then suddenly the second verse, George's guitar would almost purposely go down. It's like he's forgotten to turn the other guitar up. So for the second verse, that's gone up. And I don't know if he was doing that intentionally, thinking, or whether he purposely wanted to show what was hidden. And I kept finding that with things like, I went through 8 days a week, I Feel Fine, Day Tripper. And they all suffered this kind of, what I might say, itchy faders. It's where you kind of, oh, there we go. You know, that needs to be a bit louder, and that needs to, like, through the song, you know, instead of it just being set. So I was a bit aware of maybe he's trying to show me something in the second verse, and maybe he wants to make this next chorus a bit different to the other one by pushing this. And then I'd kind of reference, again, the split stereo mix, and it's difficult to compare the two, but the overall feeling of it is very often I go back to the originals, really. I don't know about the later stuff. I was really impressed with Magical Mystery Tour and everything, the new mixes of that and the Revolver thing. Even the Revolver thing didn't sound dirty enough for me from what I remember, because I always thought Revolver was a very clean record. I remember when it came out, you know, and we were listening to, I don't know, Hendrix had just come out, I suppose, and I'm trying to think now, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, what's Revolver, 66, isn't it?
Yeah, August 66, yeah.
Okay, so that's before all that, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Cream would have happened that year.
Cream, yeah, there you go. Distortion, yeah, well, Hendrix was there, wasn't he? The Marshall amp was turned up to 11. And that's why, like, Revolver always had a little element of dirty, like overdriven. And all the new stuff is kind of digital clean. So That's my overall feeling as a punter, really.
Do you find when you listen to the Beatles personally, does your engineer producer ears kick in to where almost like you're so critical that you can't enjoy it? Or do you find you are able to enjoy it just from back in the day?
I can enjoy it because it's the Beatles. I can enjoy it, really. If it was any other modern group, I'd put those ears on. But with the Beatles, it's just joy and happiness. I mean, I don't know. I don't play it to analyze it. I play it for fun, even if love me do it.
You're so lucky.
No, I do. I just, particularly the silly stuff. Please me, Anna, and
right. Twist and Shout.
The world is true. Yeah, Twist and Shout. I like the really soppy ones. Till There Was You, and even Michelle and things.
I thought it was odd that If I Fell wasn't on there.
Yeah.
It's an obvious, like a real power ballad.
And I'm amazed that 8 days a week he couldn't get the fade up like the original.
Oh, yeah.
Because the 8 days a week, it's like the whole thing about fade ups and fade downs is they've got to be magic. There's got to be something that takes people away, that they don't quite know what's happening. It's not just a fade up. There's a way of doing it where it kind of emotionally affects you, a fade up and a fade down, a fade at the end of the song. Lengthy fades and just a natural fade that doesn't sound like a fade. All these fades are very individual. They're quite emotional things because it's being taken away from you or it's exposing, gradually coming closer to you. So I was surprised he never redid 8 days a week fading.
Yeah, that was an odd one because that's what everybody's expecting to hear. It sneaks up on you. That was always the power of that song.
It's magic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you don't know how it is. You can't do it on the computer. You have to do it by turning the knob up or pushing the fader up. I'd spend ages on fades. I always do an edit for the fade at the end.
Yeah, and because you're also making other little choices within it, right?
Yeah.
As the bulk of the band's going down, I'm going to push up that lead guitar just a little bit.
Yeah, and put a bit more reverb on it so it's going away and that kind of thing. Not that the Beatles would do that, but that's what I tend to do. It's an emotional thing, fading in.
Yeah, you're still telling a story as they're walking into the sunset. When I think of some of the difference that happened when these tracks got cleaned up, they got remixed and reassembled, is the metaphor that comes to me is you've got 5 fingers and they can make a fist or they can make a open hand, and that open hand can punch you or can slap you or just show itself to you. And, it's the same components. But what I find with a lot of the stuff that I feel had impact sonically from the Beatles, that was a punch. And like Revolution, a punch in the face became, I shared this with Robert earlier, for me, it became sort of a polite slap. It became like the Velvet Revolution rather than,
That's why I said Giles isn't a punk rocker, you see. He wouldn't get that. Giles wouldn't be down the front gig, pogoing in the mosh pit, would he?
They should have brought in Steve Albini.
Yeah, there you go. What would Albini mixes sound like?
Yeah. whole different set of problems probably for us. But
and what about Spike, Mark Stent? He did Now and Then.
That's right.
He mixed Now and Then. Imagine him mixing the red and blue. I mean, here's Mark Stent. He's the best in the world. If you listen to the Peter Gabriel record, this new Peter Gabriel album of I.O., the Mark Stent mixes are just phenomenal. Test your hi-fi on it. It's now my speaker reference CD. You put it, for low end and frequency. Yeah, Peter Gabriel, check it out.
Those mixes are absolutely innovative. I mean, he does something so unorthodox in allowing the core of the track to have this stable sort of dynamic. And then as the song gets bigger, he doesn't chase it with the rest of the track. He lets the big elements just come and overwhelm you. So you're getting washed over by all these different elements time and time again. And then you come back dynamically to that core track that's always there. But when I first heard that, I was like, that's just friggin' genius.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I don't know how he does it. It's magic. But could you imagine him doing more? Because when this came out, I thought, hey, I wonder if Spike's done this, because he did Now and Then. You see, Spike's a commercial mixer. He's not a producer, but he's the best in the world, and that's what he's attained. You know, he's been doing it for probably 30 years. Every mix, every record he does is mega. And there's a consistent standard, and really inventive and modern and huge. And I just wonder what it would have been like if he'd mixed Day in the Life or Walrus or something.
Wow. John, I didn't have you on the show back in November, but you've taken that detour. Now and Then, what was your take on that, and what was your listening experience like? Did you hear it before you saw the video, and did you see the 12-minute making of? Take me through how you absorbed that track.
I thought, yes, I loved the video, which kind of dominated the music, really. In fact, the video was better than the music. Didn't really like the song, thought it was a bit of a sub B-side. It was kind of a throwaway thing, and it was a bit sad that, you know, I mean, that's where it came from. It was a throwaway John thing that he noodled one afternoon sitting out in the garden or something. And we've made a big thing of it. So my attention, you know, I understood what it was.
Did you see the making of?
Yeah, I did see the making of.
Yeah, there was that 12-minute video when they play John's isolated voice as extracted from that lousy cassette demo.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right, yeah. I thought you meant the official one with George and John dancing with, you know, from the 94, all that stuff. You know, the Peter Jackson thing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I enjoyed that. It was great fun. And I'm sure, as I say, young people would be really attracted to all that because they look great in the clothes and all that kind of thing. And it's all very well for us to look at it almost historically, but you got to think of the 16-year-olds, what they think of it. Will they carry it with them the way we have? I was surprised that Spike had mixed it because I was really disappointed with the guitar solo. The main thing. I thought the guitar solo should have been up front, louder, and more like George. I know Paul played it. I don't see what was wrong with Paul imitating George. And he should have shown off a bit more. Like, you know, I mean, George doesn't show off, but I think there could have been something a little bit more George in what Paul did, or the sound or something, because it was a highlight. It didn't fall flat. It just leveled out. And also the strings, the cello, all the orchestral stuff didn't sound fat enough and was kind of submerged. You wanted it there, and it was a sound. It wasn't a rhythmic thing. It didn't create surges. There was no climax or real dynamics. It kind of sat there like a synth or in the background. So it was a disappointment for me, but I loved it. You know, I wouldn't buy it, but at the same time, I loved it. You know, it was entertaining. You know, it was the Beatles. I just loved it.
So you're saying Giles should remix it?
Yeah.
Well, Robert and I had this conversation. I got my 2 cents in on it a while ago. I said, yeah, maybe in 50 years, we'll get a remix of Now and Then that reveals what they actually recorded.
Yeah.
The fact that the early tracks were only encompassed one tape ever, you know, and again, that be it mono, twin track, 4-track tape, that they weren't multiple tapes that they were working with, that they were kind of boxed in with what they were able to extract. The fact that the Beatles were also working within their limits when they were recording them. They were working within the format. They did overdubs, but they worked within the 4-track. Everything was there when they were done. That simplicity, because all that's really available for you then, there's a lot of interpretation available for you. You can clear that up. And then your only decision is, like John was saying, where do I ride the faders on this thing? Where do I want to bring attention to different things? Those choices, when you think about how they did the original work with the red consoles, the sort of writing that modern engineers do, especially digital engineers, will write everything. There's automation everywhere. That wasn't really going on. You know, static mixes were almost the rule, with a few exceptions of like bringing up a solo, bringing up a highlight, the important moment at this point. I'm going to let you hear that. The primary difference we get in the Giles remixes is he doesn't hear one or two important moments. He might hear 20 important moments to him that are little moments that might actually distract from the primary moment. But again, I think in general, it's a pretty successful set, the Red album. The Blue album, that's recombining stuff that's from the 50th anniversary almost entirely. There's only a handful of new tracks. Let's talk about I Am the Walrus.
You had to go there.
It should never have been touched, really. I mean, Walrus is, I was going to say sacred, but then everything's sacred. But, Walrus is perfection the way it was, because it's everyone's got their own relationship to it, of when you first heard it and what you expect from it. And whether it's a track, are you going to play it at a party to get everyone dancing? No. Are you going to play it in the car? You're going to play it when do you play I'm the Walrus? It stands on its own and it shouldn't be tampered with. It's a shame. String quartet, there's no menace in the new mix.
Oh, interesting.
The menace of Walrus. There's something quite scary about the whole thing, whether it's the cellos or the, everything. Everything about it is just amazing.
And while the original recording went sideways because there's at one point where it goes almost completely mono, and they only could make up for it by adding a little bit of reverb and getting you a little bit of space with it, because they were, again, working with a pretty severe edit at that particular point in the song. Even that, in the original, that dramatic, jarring sort of shift in the original stereo, it works to the favor of the song. It catches you off guard. You're like, what the heck's going on here? And while, the new mix is a superior stereo mix in terms of clarity, modern, and all of that, once again, these idiosyncrasies of the format that they were working in, of the technical restrictions that they had, that made that song what it was, are lost now. And with that, again, you lose the disquiet of it. The vocal, which was this bitey, gritty, crappy, just grated on your ears, it's distorted, but probably with even harmonics, not odd harmonics. So again, it just doesn't have that menace that John mentioned. It doesn't have that disquiet that's reflected in the lyrics. Yellow matter custard, dripping from a dead dog's eye. You felt that in the original one. You felt like, you felt it.
But what was it that made you felt it? Was it the tone of the voice? Was it what the cellos were doing at that time? Yeah, it's one thing.
Well, that's the beautiful thing, is that whole combination of things. And again, Martin is a producer. And I think Ken Scott worked on that, and Jeff Emmerich. I'm not sure.
Martin George wrote the strings, of course. He wrote the whole string part. And the playing, the aggression in the cellos, choice of instruments.
And there's a very conscious choice of what's most important right now. What carries the emotion? What carries the moment? And it was those biting strings were what reinforced the emotion of the moment. And you barely hear anything else in the original when that comes up. On the new one, you hear everything.
Yeah.
You hear everything. And again, to me, that is the difference between the fist and the open hand. Same number of fingers, but this is diffused, and light and air and everything comes through it. But what we want out of that moment is a punch.
It was shocking to me when I first heard it, thinking the person responsible for this has misunderstood or misread everything the song was about in changing it so utterly. It had a nightmarish quality before. This is a very dark song. Don't let the video and Magical Mystery Tour fool you. And it changed into something that, even if you're trying to see it through the ears and eyes of, well, this is meant for 21st century teenagers to get into the Beatles, I don't get it. Then you should make it scary as hell, because that's what they want. Instead of a piece of ice cream, which is what John described Revolution as when he heard it on the Blue Album in 73. But you like Magical Mystery Tour, the title track.
I do, yeah. And Your Mother Should Know. Mm-hmm. And Fall on the Hill. A whole Magical Mystery Tour, new mixes, I think, sound fantastic.
Yeah, again, the majority of the work is pretty successful, save from what was brought forward from the 50th anniversary collections, which, again, I feel almost universally those missed the boat, and that favored a balanced, and this is my bias, and John can chime in on this. I think great mixes are unbalanced. I think great mixes make big choices and have for lack of a better term, they have a directorial point of view. Mm-hmm. There's a viewpoint that's expressed, starting from the producer. And the 50th anniversary work, for the most part, is so agnostic and flat in a way. And again, representational. I hear everything, I see everything, but to no direct impact. And if I didn't have a reference of the initial impact that these songs had on me, my feeling about them would be almost indifferent emotionally in many, many cases.
Right. And I think that's what's informing a lot of the outrage toward these things by the older fans. The young fans don't know to be outraged because they have no frame of reference.
I was going to say that, yeah. If you're a 14-year-old listening to it, my grandson, I should try it. I should play him the different mixes and I'll report back. I have my grandson's 14. I play him the new ones and then play him the mono and the different periods and see which one he'll probably get bored. Or ask for Yellow Submarine or something.
Yeah. Speaking to your point earlier, Jerry, about just because you can, should you? I found some interesting touches throughout the 50th releases and the Red Album, for instance, Yesterday, which is a very, very basic, simple song to begin with. And there I detected the violins mixed to one channel and the cellos to the other. And maybe, I don't think they would have done that in 1965 simply because they just had the limitations of the tracks. Something they could have done in 1969, but didn't, was the stereo imaging of Ringo's drum kit for the Abbey Road tracks, but they didn't. And Giles is doing it now. I look at that and think, well, is that an improvement? Is it geared toward the younger audience expecting to hear that sort of stereo representation of the kit? Or is it you're doing this because you can? Is it in any way enhancing the listening experience of this song? And I guess that just comes down to the individual listening to it. It's in the ear of the beholder. I noted it. I was a little jarred by it. But then at the end of the day, are these recordings made for me anyway? Am I the target audience? I don't think so.
I don't have an answer for it. I do believe that some of this is born of, and maybe that's one of the issues, because we're all seduced by technology. Technology is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. So I've got this Mal tool now. And look, I can pull the tom-toms out of any drum fill that Ringo did. I can pull the toms out now. So I do. And I can pan those drums now. So I do. Is it necessary? Does it make it a better mix?
Is it revelatory?
Does it make it a hit?
Will it get it on radio?
The record, will it get more plays on the radio if you pan the toms? It may do, actually.
I was watching an interview with Bob Clearmountain the other day, and he talked about how he keeps his drums like really tight in terms of the stereo field. He keeps his drums really tight. And, why do you do that? You've got this whole sound field available. And he said, well, because it's distracting.
Yeah.
It's distracting.
Yeah.
And if you listen to the biggest hits of the classic era, for the most part, the drums might have taken up 4 tracks of audio in that era. And they're usually like fairly tightly packed. We believe we're hearing them. We believe we're hearing those fills go all over the place, but they're truly not. And sometimes they're just dead center. So, I think, again, in some cases with this, it's available to me. Wow, I can strip those things out. Then I'm going to use them. If I was able to get 4 signals out of the drum set rather than just having one, I'm going to use those 4. And now I'm going to create space with them because I can. but not because it makes it better. When you talked about yesterday, the choice of, we can strip the cello out and strip the violins from the cello in the string section with yesterday. It loses its connectedness as an arrangement.
It's always about vocal, really, because what you really identify with as a human is the voice, the vocal. And that's what your attention, everything else is superfluous. But if something interferes, like suddenly a tom-tom comes out of the left speaker, you don't hear that bit of vocal. You've been distracted from the vocal. So one of the things about the mix is it's always subservient to the vocal. Everything is, that's what people hear, and that's what you should never distract from. Whether it's loud or quiet, it doesn't matter, but the continuity of it, of the vocal telling the story and people following it. I'm talking pop music, of course, and anything else can be, music you want to get on the radio, you've got to have that vocal undisturbed, but full of charisma and power and feeling and everything else with the music. And yeah, I guess that's right. Listening to some of these mixes, the movement of the instrumentation is a little distracting of the vocal, even though I know the vocals so well and the track so well. I know all the words. But I just know when you're mixing, particularly with stereo, if you have things flying off to the left-hand side, you're not going to be part of the vocal. You're not going to be in there in his head because there's something happening over there. Anyway, so,
yeah, and the idea is that you're creating this foundation for that story to be told on top of.
Mm-hmm.
And the subservient characters of it, in a more classic approach to pop music, they're going to happen in the gaps between the vocal. They're going to happen in the spaces. The biggest example always is the guitar solo. And the guitar solo is its own vocal, right? It comes right up and hits you in the face. So where some of these early mixes, the early Red Album mixes, where some of them go south, is that you'll hear like George's scratchy guitar over in the left channel that was never meant to be heard because he's waiting. He's kind of just getting himself ready to play the fill that he does when Paul stops singing.
Yeah, there you go.
But now we get to hear him scratch away while he's
counting.
1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Which I guess to people who are the ultimate train spotters of Beatles, that is like you want to hear everything you haven't heard or noticed before. It's like why you buy bootlegs. You want to hear take 19 of something because it's different and it's novel. But should be creating novelty be the driving force of 2 compilations encompassing their career? I don't think so. And that's the problem I've had with the 50th things, is that I just wanted these releases to sound a little better. I don't need to hear the things you took out or added. As interesting as they might be, these will never be my go-to versions. These are just going to be a little side novelty / semi-official bootleg for me. But they're not given that cachet. They're given the cachet of, the 50th release. Guess what, teenagers? Look what we got for you. You're going to dig this. And I'm not sure that they are, because they have no frame of reference. It's just, I don't know. It just seems like the thinking was not very clear, or it was done by committee or something. It's not very respectful to the intent, ultimately. John, if you had been the one tasked, if your last name was Martin, and I said, hey, John, we want you to go back to these Beatles things, make something out of this, what would have been your intent?
Which of course, John, would be how you get the job, right? That's how you get the gig.
Yeah. What would I do?
Yeah. What would you have seen as your mission?
I'd be terrified, actually. I'd be terrified for the responsibility of doing it and the amount of work. I mean, give me 4 tracks, but not 40 tracks, 50, 60, 80 tracks. I mean, it's a hell of a lot of work. And the responsibility, to do all that is years and years of work and continually focus and trying to please everyone. Not just us, but trying to please, I don't know who signs off on these mixes, whether it's Paul, Yoko, or who, or I don't know who Giles is subservient to, who he plays his mixes to and who has the final say. But I'd be terrified doing it, really.
Would you have a book, though? Would you have a mission? Would you kind of set yourself these guardrails of how you think philosophically you'd be approaching the work?
Yeah. I would want it to sound, what can I say, close to the original. Not close to the originals, but as much as what I know about the Beatles, John, Paul, George and Ringo, I'd want to do something to please them. Because every time I work with a band, I always want to please the band. That's what I'm doing it for. They're hired. I know the record company is paying me, but I'm being hired to assist them in their creativity, their expression. So I'd always look at John, Paul, George and Ringo thinking, would they dig this? Would it be tough enough for John and Paul as well? You know, would it represent them all in the right way? And one thing I should say about all this, I don't know what you call it, MAL and AI and all this extraction thing, it's really a toy, really. It's like a facsimile. It's not the real thing. The thing is, what we've been listening to in the past, although it's come straight off tape onto the disc cutting head, you know, it's real solid objects. And any of these things, once you get it on the computer, it's not real. It's a facsimile. So even when I listen to these new mixes, what I'm listening to is a digital, and I keep using the word facsimile, of what is really there, a simulation of what's really there. I'm not really listening to the tape. Maybe Rhino does it different. I've got a lot of respect for all those, and even people like Yazoo. You know, the interesting thing, you know, Yazoo that releases all the old blues 78s, Blind Lemon Jefferson and stuff, and they're great CDs. Robert Johnson, for instance, which is on Sony. When you hear the actual straight off the 78s with all the crackles and the noise reduction, you've got that feeling of what it was to hear that in the 1928 or something. And when you listen to it all cleaned up, it's like watching color television for the first time. It's not real. It's not like something you can hold on to. I think one of the strange things for me was hearing this Robert Johnson set, hearing it all cleaned up. This was years ago, of course, you know, Robert Johnson recordings. No crackles, no distortion. And it's just like a little circular thing that is polished and clean. Whereas the original is all kind of dirty and bigger and huger, and you're closer to it. One of the things with all these things is it often sounded to me like they've moved the microphone away, particularly on Robert Johnson and blues recordings, because they're all just recorded on one mic straight onto the disc cutter in a hotel room in Texas somewhere. And when you listen to the cleaned up one, it's like someone's replaced the old RCA moving coil mic with a new Sony digital Danish kind of hi-fi condenser mic and moved it back like 12 inches, 15 inches. That's my thing. And maybe that applies to these Beatles things. You know, you're not getting rid of crackles and noise and stuff, but at the same time, you're listening to a copy of it. It's not a tape copy, a copy of a copy. It's extracted from one media and put into another. It's like taking a photograph of a painting. You take a picture of, you know, a photo of the Sistine Chapel. It's never really going to be the real thing. You take a photograph of the Grand Canyon. It's never going to be like standing there on the rim of the Grand Canyon. And that's how I feel about all these copies and digital and the actual thing you're working with. Sometimes it sounds to me like a really low resolution MP3.
It's a really, really excellent point. So with the extractions, there's an additive element that we forget that has to be there.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm tearing this bass part out of this drum part, I've left a bunch of holes in both of them.
Yep.
Right? And so now I've got to ask the technology to fill those holes back in.
Error correct it, yeah.
Yeah. I've asked them to fill in the blanks, and the technology is interpreting based off of, this is like the basis of compression, of audio compression as well. You reduce the file size by reducing the amount of information that's there. What the software does is, based on what came before and what came after, it averages those and fills in the blanks. So truly, John, just a fantastic point to bring up. So truly what they're working with in these reassemblies is a facsimile of the original audio.
Yeah. And I just wondered if Giles has read your book and used any tape simulation. In terms of, do you know what I mean? Like what he should have done, because it doesn't sound like it's 50 years old or 60 years old, does it?
No.
But you can do that. You can trick people into thinking that. I don't know.
But again, that idea that what we're hearing in these anniversary versions, in these remixes, the source material for them, post-extraction, you can't visualize that as original material anymore.
No.
Because it is partially original and it's partially supplemented by the technology to give you a simulation of a whole that was never there in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Is it ever okay to do this?
Yeah, because we can.
Well, the thought that I'd had is like, okay, these recordings were state-of-the-art when they were produced. They're still pretty damn good. They sound amazing. Now you're tweaking and creating novelty and all that stuff where it didn't exist before. Good on you. The first thing that's top of mind whenever we have these discussions is, well, what about a recording that could use it in the first place? And I think of the Star Club tapes, a subpar recording that every Beatle fan who's ever heard them would love to hear them optimized. I don't care if you're creating holes and filling them in. We need those holes filled. We want to hear that band. So is that an appropriate use?
Definitely, I'd say.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that it isn't appropriate to use it. What I'm noting, again, from John cueing my noodle up here, is we have to listen to them in context. We have to understand that aspect of them as we are evaluating them, especially if you're not letting the music just wash over you, like mercifully most of the world does. But for those of us that don't let it wash over us and we're trying to understand it, we have to understand it in context. That is the context of it. These technologies do remarkable things, and their ability to fill in those gaps is remarkable as well. It's even better if the technology allows for intervention. If the technology allows for someone like John to listen to that and go, yeah, that ain't right. You got close there, but no, this bit of it, need to look at that again. We need to adjust that capture because what it captured was not accurate or not the intent. If it allows those kind of interventions, then it gets even better. All I'm saying by it is, once again, we're not listening to mixes that are true to the Beatles because the Beatles weren't there. George Martin wasn't there. So they're not Beatle mixes anymore. They're not meant for us if we're listening for Beatles mixes. And you keep that in mind as you're evaluating these. It might be easier to swallow them, but can it serve a positive purpose? Absolutely. And I mean, the Star Club stuff is a great example. That's a history that can be brought back to life. Where I draw the line with this sort of thing is where, to think of another metaphor, is where you're colorizing black and white photographs, something that drives me crazy. Because you are truly reinterpreting history by not knowing and yet saying or purporting that that's the color of that. And so, again, my feeling about Pepper's the best example for me, the Pepper 50th anniversary, where I think that goes south is that some of the choices that were made were to let us see things that we were never intended to see, or in this case, hear things that we were never intended to hear. There was lots of noise and lots of crap in old recordings because you just couldn't get rid of it. Mics were open and you got rid of it by dropping the fader. It wasn't there because we wanted it to be there. It was there because we didn't have noise gates and we didn't have expander gates and we didn't have technology to get rid of it. Once we had it, that expander gate's on pretty much all the time when you're tracking, because I don't want that excess noise. That excess noise takes up space. And the clarity of modern recordings is because I can get rid of everything except what's intended. These remixes bring things to our ears that we were never intended to hear.
That's where the guardrail should have been.
For me, it is. Yeah, and that's why, I go back to the more archival approach to it, of the closer that you are to the original intent in every way that you have control over. For me, those are the most successful things, the most successful versions, And the other thing about those versions is those versions will drive people to the history. They'll drive them to the original mixes. They'll drive them to explore those. Mm-hmm. I don't know that the 50th anniversary mixes will drive people back to the original albums, mono or stereo.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that is the first exposure. If those are the gateways for certain people, if when they do track back to the original, they find them wanting because they're used to these bastardizations.
You can't win anyway, can you? Every time there's a different version, it's like when they release different takes. I did a band called Bebop Deluxe, you might have heard of, going off the Beatles track, Bebop Deluxe, and we recorded a live album in 1978 or something.
Live in the Air Age?
Live in the Air Age, that's exactly what it is.
Great album.
We recorded 7 concerts, big concerts, Hammersmith Odeon, with the Stones Mobile, 24 track, and we recorded 7 concerts, same set list every night, mostly the same chat as well, it wasn't really ad-libbed. Recorded 7 concerts, sat down, chose the best song from each concert, and mixed it. Even though the finished album, some were from Hammersmith, some were from Manchester, some were from Glasgow, mixed it. Cherry Red have just released a box set, and they've got someone to remix all 7 concerts. So when you buy the box set, I think you get 16 CDs.
Wow.
And it's 7 concerts of the same songs, and some are shit, some are out of tune, the drummer drops his sticks, there's all that stuff going on. And yet you can listen to every concert for every little nuance, every different solo that he plays and that kind of thing. This is Bebop Deluxe. It's not, the Allman Brothers or someone special, like you're going to be really analytical about what's being played. And it's sold out. They've sold, I don't know how many, they've sold 20,000 or something at £100 a go.
Wow.
And someone actually listens. Yeah, it is. I was shocked,
I bought it back in the day because it was on white vinyl. I thought this is cool.
Did you? Yeah, that's right. But get this, because they didn't have any notes or track sheets, they didn't know what were the best concert that I'd chosen for the finished album. So they couldn't actually remix a finished album because they didn't know which of the 7 they'd take it. Fuck it, just mix all of them.
So they shotgunned it out there and didn't involve you. Unbelievable.
So I don't know how that relates to this. It's like the people want to hear everything, every little take and false start and every little Ringo dropping his sticks. That kind of thing, as you say, George kind of getting ready to play. And it might be interesting to us, but most people just want to hear the tune and feel good and maybe dance or something,
Yeah. I could see, I've always thought this because Beatles is like such a different animal from everything else on Earth, is that, there are millions of people that do want to hear every drop drumstick and George get ready to play his solo. But do like a Rhino handmade version, limited edition, make it available for people who want it, and then just mainstream the red and the blue for the people who just want to hear Beatles. That you could serve both interests, but they always seem to sort of compromise along the way, and it like pisses off everybody. So that seems to be the model.
To some degree, it's a no-win proposition. Certainly a way to look at it is, those that are new to the Beatles catalog, they won't know, as John was pointing out, they won't know the difference. They wouldn't know that this is what, from someone like my point of view of like, this is what it's supposed to sound like. Mm-hmm. They just know what they're hearing. Even at that level, my personal feeling is still great mixes, and like the Peter Gabriel I.O. mixes demonstrate, great mixes have very big choices made in them. Mm-hmm. And Martin's original mixes of the Beatles tracks had big choices that were made. And those choices are almost entirely absent from most of the 50th anniversary stuff. It's biased toward, I can hear that, as opposed to either recreating those definitive choices or making choices of your own. Where he did make choices of his own, I'm the Walrus here in this new set is probably, it might be unfortunately representative of. The last minute of I Am the Walrus on the new set is a bit of a train wreck.
Yeah.
Like Where's my Shakespeare?
Yeah.
Where'd my Shakespeare go?
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song performed by the Corgis. Something About the Beatles is an evergreen podcast.